We're here at the Center for Popular Music here at Middle Tennessee State University. I'm with the director of the archive, Greg Reish, and I thought it would be fun to come here and show you some of the wonderful things that they've got here at the archive, specifically some recording formats. There's another lecture in this course about the history of recording formats, but there's nothing like putting your eyes and hands on the actual items. And so, Greg, tell us what we've got here.
Well, we've pulled out some examples of all the major commercial recording formats. Starting here with the earliest one, this is an Edison-style cylinder and actually happens to be on Edison's own label. Edison, of course, invented this kind of cylinder disc phonograph in the late 1870s and commercialized it about a decade later. Many people don't realize that he actually got into the music business with his own label, and then others followed suit. There's also a misnomer about these. They're often called wax cylinders, although the very, very early prototypes were made of wax or coated in wax. Most of these commercially released ones are made of something more durable, a kind of metallic compound, essentially metallic soap. And they have about 2 to 2.5 minutes worth of music on each one, and have surprisingly clear quality when they're in good shape and are played back with the right kind of equipment.
So you have items here that you can still play back.
Oh, absolutely.
Today.
We have some of the equipment to do that on, and we also have a setup by which we can make digital transfers of these and then clean them up a little bit more if needed, and then we can enjoy them as much as we like once they're in the digital realm.
And so what era would that have been made?
Well, these were first on the commercial market in late 1880s. Initially, there was very little home usage of these. Most of these were sold to some kind of public facility, an arcade or a pharmacy or maybe a train station, where you'd put a nickel in a slot and put tubes in your ears and you could hear it. But shortly thereafter, these were marketed to the home and also the business markets,
right,
for taking dictation. That was originally Edison's idea for the primary use for this,
right,
was in taking dictation. And once it was transcribed, this could be wiped clean and reused a certain number of times before it wore out. But then others quickly realized, and Edison got in on that too, that music was a huge market here. And so these started to be sold to home markets with home machines, most of which, or many of which, both recorded and played back music. And these were in use, they were popular until about the mid-teens, and they continued to be produced through the 20s, by which time they were a fairly obsolete format, but there were still a few companies hanging on with these. Now, many people think that cylinders were replaced by flat platter discs, and that's not quite true. If you look at the chronology, they were really overlapping formats.
Like most of them are, really, in this whole
that's true. Like most of them are, but
right,
these really overlapped in a considerable to a considerable degree. The flat platter disc was invented by Emil Berliner in the mid 1890s, and so it very quickly appeared on the consumer market as a direct competitor to the cylinder format. And these came initially in different sizes, and it took a little while before the 78 RPM speed became the industry standard.
And these are all 478.
These are 78s, yeah. And we have a couple here from major labels like the Columbia record that I'm holding. This is an Al Jolson record, and Al Jolson, of course, was a major singing star who came out of the vaudeville tradition and lived through the jazz era. He's also well known as the star of the first major Hollywood talkie, which was a musical, of course, The Jazz Singer in 1927. One of the things interesting about Jolson's career with regard to the recording technology at the time is that he started his career before electric recording with microphones. And he of course, came out of a musical theater background, so he was a good example of someone who belted. For whom the measure of a good voice was, can they hear you in the back row without any amplification?
And the most famous example maybe of the belter is right here,
right.
Ethel Merman.
And Ethel, of course, is a slightly later generation, but Ethel Merman, as primarily a Broadway performer, she had that quality as well. But in 1925, which was in the midst of the 78 era, when electrical recording came onto the scene. So all recording before that had been purely mechanical and acoustic. There was no electricity involved in the process. So in 1925, microphones and a completely different recording process that can capture more nuances. And that allows for a new kind of singer to emerge. And Jolson continued to thrive in his commercial career through that period, but he became a deliberate kind of throwback in his style. It was an old-fashioned style. His style, the modern style was replaced by a singer like Bing Crosby. And I'm holding here another major label Decca release from Bing Crosby. This happens to be Swanee River, Stephen Foster's song, the real title of which is Old Folks at Home. But it's so well known by that hook way down upon the Swanee River that became the de facto title. Bing Crosby was a good example of a crooner, which is someone whose vocal style took advantage of the microphone technology.
Right, he's really credited with innovating, and basically you just place when you put your mouth very close to a microphone, it's a very different kind of sound that the listener can hear, and a different kind of emotional response, really,
Absolutely.
that can be elicited by
it's nuanced,
these kinds of
it's
singers.
intimate, and Bing Crosby, who probably would not have been heard in a public theater without amplification, but with this new recording technology, he took full advantage of that in his style.
Women swooned.
They did swoon. He was as big a pop star from the mid-20s through the 30s as existed anywhere.
Yeah.
So these are a couple of major label releases. We also have here a couple of independent label releases. This is a little bit later, from the late 1940s. This is a hillbilly record, as a lot of country music was called at the time. This is Grandpa Jones. Some people may remember him from his appearances on the Hee Haw television program in later decades. But this was recorded for King Records, a very important independent out of Cincinnati. And King was involved with country music of the time, with blues and some early rockabilly and a number of other important genres.
The genres that the large labels didn't want to touch with a 10-foot pole.
Well, by the 1940s, some of them were getting into country, particularly as the post-war economic boom led to a boom in the recording industry.
And all that.
Yeah, so there was... As one famous newspaper article put it, the industry generally realized there was gold in them nar hillbillies. But there were still a lot of independents who were giving voice to artists who couldn't find major labels, servicing regional markets primarily. And here is a lesser-known subsidiary of King. Many of these labels, both majors and independents, had smaller pressing subsidiaries. So King had Queen, of course, one of their subsidiary labels out of Cincinnati, and this is more of a blues record. Bull Moose Jackson singing the Bull Moose Jackson blues from about the same era, the late 40s. And this Ethel Merman album is a good example of where that word album came from. Because 78s were singles, they had music on originally just one side and eventually both sides, but limited to about one song, 3.5 minutes or so on each side. If people wanted to have longer collections of music, perhaps from a show like this, Irving Berlin's Annie Get Your Gun, a very famous Broadway musical, so people wanted to have a wider array of selections from one source like this, they could be sold or compiled at home even into albums, which are very much like photo albums. So these 78s are now put into individual sleeves, as you can see. This notion that you could have an array of individual songs comprising an album is what gave rise to that word being used for LPs and even CDs in later decades. So a lot of these were sold like this, prepackaged, but one could also buy an empty album and just sort of fill it up with your favorite records. Right. So we like to call that sometimes the early 20th century version of the playlist. You put together a list of your favorite records. and have them all in one place. As we move into the post-war years, the 1940s and into the 50s, open reel tape is now a very popular format for recording at home, but there are also commercially released open reel tapes like this one. And the reels, these are quarter-inch tapes, but the reels themselves were available in different sizes, depending on how much music was on them. And these were fairly widely used during the 1950s. There was some feeling among audiophiles who wanted a higher level of fidelity that this was a good format for them. But at the same time, we have the introduction of vinyl flat discs. In 1949, the 45 RPM single, which is made of vinyl. The 78s were generally made of shellac, a different material. These are lighter and more flexible. The 78s are heavy and brittle.
Yes.
They actually can break, whereas these can warp if they're exposed to too much heat.
If you've ever seen one of those old slapstick films of somebody breaking
That's
a 78,
right.
You can't do that with a 12-inch LP.
And that would hurt, I have to say, because these things are heavy. But the vinyl discs are much lighter weight, a little bit cheaper and easier to produce. Coming out of the 40s and into the 1950s, these began to replace 78s. 78s continued to be made through the 50s, but increasingly it was considered an old-fashioned format. But it is remarkable to think back on how long the 78 shellac disc was the predominant format. I mean, we're talking about from sometime around the turn of the 20th century all the way to the midpoint of the century.
Longer than
any other format.
Except, I guess, maybe arguably
LPs, which is now experiencing a nice resurgence of interest. But these were the cheap single alternatives to the single 78s, made of vinyl. These were one song per side and played at a 45 RPM.
Well, and this song, too, was a song that caused riots. It's Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley, which, of course, was one of the big first rock and roll hits.
Yeah, 1954.
Caused riots in movie theaters.
Yeah, and many people think that this was one of the landmark moments, the release of this particular record, in the birth of rock and roll.
With its B-side, 13 women and only one man in town.
But it's also interesting to note that this 45 release, also the same song, came out on 78 as an example of the overlap of formats at that time. In fact, we have a copy here in the archive of a Decca 78 of that exact same recording. And then, of course, the large format, LP, long playing format in vinyl, is what many people now think of as the quintessential album. But again, that word harkens back to this earlier kind of flip-through book of recordings. And these also appeared in the very late 1940s and picked up steam in the 50s and were in wide usage until CDs hit the market in the early 80s. And as we mentioned, they're now experiencing a revival of sorts. This was a great leap forward in convenience for listeners, if nothing else, because now instead of just putting on a record and hearing 3.5 minutes of music, you could now hear 15 to 20 minutes on each side. And eventually, by the time we get to the rock era in the mid-1960s, artists and producers are starting to think more about how they can take advantage of that amount of space
format,
as not just, I can fit so many 3-minute songs, but now I can have longer songs and I can string them together. And we have the birth of a concept album with the Beach Boys and the Beatles and many others following suit.
And by the way, that's a wonderful Japanese...
Yeah, it's an import. It's an import pressing of "Kisses Hotter Than Hell," 1974.
Love it.
I believe is the date on this, with all of the song titles and information in both English and Japanese. And then maybe we reach what some people might consider the low point of recording formats, the 8-track tape, which appeared in the 1960s and was widely used through the 1970s. It had a convenience factor that was an advantage over the LPs and 45s, because cars could be equipped with this, portable players could be equipped with 8-track capability. They're simple, durable, but they didn't sound all that good, frankly.
Although some of us who grew up with, cars that had these still remember the sound that an 8-track
Oh, yeah.
makes when you
And the sound of switching from program to program.
right, that ka-chunk, yeah.
Because each of these
Yeah.
tapes has 4 programs that can be changed manually by pushing the button, or at the end of one program, it would automatically go to the next.
Yeah.
But this was a common tape format. Of course, much, much easier than the open reel tapes, which had to be played at home and threaded through through the heads and so on. This is, the idea from this came from radio cartridges that were being used, where time is of the essence. You just punch something in and let it play. This is Barry Manilow's greatest hits, released in the late 70s. He was, of course, a major artist as a songwriter and then as a performing artist as well. Arista Records. And the 8-tracks were essentially replaced by the smaller format cassettes, what were originally called compact cassettes, because they were so much smaller than any of the open reel or 8-track formats. But these were, for the time, sort of the ultimate in convenience. Playing in the car, playing in boom boxes, home stereos with tape decks, and so on. Also, not the greatest sound quality. These, pretty thin tape, not the highest quality tape, and they often degraded with repeated playings. But they were very, very popular among consumers.
Well, and is also experiencing a resurgence again among kids, mixtapes and in indie rock bands and so forth. I mean, I don't know if
That's
you've
right.
been following this.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
fun.
the notion of the mixtape,
Right.
which many people in the 70s and 80s and even a little bit into the 90s considered kind of an art form in and of itself, which
and a
is
very
now
personal gift.
and a very personal gift, which
Yeah.
people are still doing in the form of playlists and other kinds of curated collections.
Doesn't
but
feel the same, though,
It doesn't
does it?
feel the same because it doesn't take as much effort
Right.
to put that together. It
drop
used
and
to
drag.
be. It used to be a real. I did this many times for old
Me too.
girlfriends. Right?
Well,
made
yes.
made mixtapes of some of my favorite songs, and spent the better part of an afternoon sometimes putting them all together in just the right order
Yeah.
and checking the levels and
Yeah.
and all of that. Now these formats, the LP primarily, but also these tape cartridge formats, were eventually replaced in the 80s by the CD, the compact disc, which came out in the early 80s. Directed at first primarily at the audiophile market because of the very high quality sound reproduction. So a lot of classical CDs. I was working at that time in record retail when these came out, and I remember the early CD buyers were primarily classical enthusiasts who wanted to hear things in.
Those were some of the first recordings that were transferred over to the digital format
that's right.
from the libraries of great labels like CBS, Columbia, and so forth.
That's right. The initial thought was that the audio fidelity, the purity of the digital format was something that could be fully appreciated with the nuances and the dynamic range of classical music,
snobbery
symphonic
there, huh?
music. Oh, clearly a bit of snobbery, but it didn't take long for the rock and popular music industries
No.
to realize that this, had a lot
Right.
to offer for them and their consumers as well. So the CD also was an improvement in the convenience of music for consumers, because now you didn't even have to flip a record or flip a cassette tape. Now we could get as much as 80 minutes or close to 80 minutes of music on one disc
Right.
that was easily portable, durable, could be played at home, could be played in the car, portable players. This is the era of the cassette tape Walkman giving way to the CD Walkman. So this notion of having very high quality sound everywhere you go. It started a little bit with the cassettes, but that doesn't have the fidelity of the CDs.
Yeah.
Purely digital format. A lot of LPs were now being transferred over, but a lot of newer recordings were being touted as purely digital from start to finish. We used to have that
Right.
little 3-stage
I remember, yeah.
code on the back of a disc. If it was DDD, it was digital from recording through the
Right.
mastering and to the delivery to the home consumer. So that was something that we all looked for. Now there are many people looking back on it who think that maybe the digital recording medium loses a certain amount of warmth that analog has, and I think that's part of what's feeding the vinyl revival a little bit. But at the time, DDD was considered just the absolute best in sonic quality. Whatever the artists and the producers intended, you were going to hear that if you were playing it back on a decent system. And of course, from digital, we move into the era of the MP3, which is still with us today, although that's starting to give way to streaming delivery. But the notion was that we didn't need a disc to house digital files, especially if they were in a compressed format, which MP3s certainly are.
Right.
And that allowed them to be distributed through iTunes, through Amazon, and other retail outlets. But it also enabled easier trading and file sharing and so on, which has given rise to all sorts of legal battles and problems within the music industry. But now I think those are starting to become less and less an issue as streaming seems to be emerging in one way or another as the new delivery format. And that, of course, is fraught with its own set of problems that the industry is trying to work out, even as we stand here.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating tour of audio formats. Thank you very much. This is the Center for Popular Music at Middle Tennessee State University. We've been speaking with the director of the center, Gregory Risch. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Jen.